How much does it cost to say no? For most of us, it's just an uncomfortable moment, a difficult conversation, maybe a strained relationship. But for one man in Israel, that simple word cost him everything: his land, his dignity, his life. This is the story of Naboth, a man almost forgotten by history, but whose no echoed through the centuries as a cry against injustice. When saying no cost a life, Naboth chose integrity and paid the highest price. You are about to discover one of the most thrilling and tragic biblical stories ever recorded. A story of greed, betrayal, abuse of power, and perverted justice, but also about courage, character, and what it means to remain faithful when the whole world conspires against you. And there's something I'll reveal only at the end, something about Naboth's fate that completely changes how we see this story, something that God saw even when everyone else looked the other way. Get ready, because when power decides who lives, only the truth endures. There are words that change destinies. Yes can open doors. Maybe keeps options open. But no. That little word has the power to challenge entire systems. And in Israel, during the reign of King Ahab, an ordinary man uttered that no and unleashed one of the most tragic biblical stories ever told. Naboth was not a prophet. He was not a priest. He had no armies, riches, or political influence. He was just an ordinary citizen with a vineyard, a small property inherited from his ancestors, nothing special in the eyes of the world. But when power knocked on his door with an offer, Naboth did something rare. He refused, and that no wasn't impulsive. It wasn't pride, it was faithfulness. Because for Naboth, that vineyard represented more than land. It represented obedience to God. And he knew that some things are priceless, not even when the one offering them is the king. But what happens when a powerless man faces a limitless empire? What happens when integrity collides with greed? What happens when saying no to wrong means signing your own death warrant? The answer lies in the vineyards of Jezreel, and it begins with a man invisible to the eyes of power. If you look for Naboth in the great accounts of Israel, you probably won't find him easily. He doesn't appear in genealogies of heroes. He doesn't lead battles. He doesn't perform miracles. He is one of the forgotten characters of the Bible, those whose names appear briefly, but whose stories carry eternal lessons. Naboth lived in Jezreel, a strategic city in northern Israel. His name means fruits or germination, a simple name that reflects his simple life. He was a man of the land, someone who woke up early to tend the vineyards, who knew every stone of the soil that his parents and grandparents had cultivated before him. Imagine the scene: the rising sun illuminating the rows of vines, the scent of ripe grapes in the air, Naboth walking among the plants with calloused hands, inspecting each bunch, feeling the texture of the leaves. For him, that land was not just a business. It was identity, it was memory, it was sacred heritage, protected by the law of Moses, which prohibited the permanent sale of family properties. While Naboth worked quietly, obeying the law and honoring his ancestors, he didn't know that his vineyard had caught the attention of someone very powerful, someone accustomed to getting everything he wanted, someone who lived in a nearby palace, and who watched that land with envy. Naboth was invisible, but his vineyard was not, and that visibility would cost him everything. Because in the Bible, human injustice often begins like this, with the powerful seeing what doesn't belong to them and deciding to take it by any means necessary. That vineyard was much more than it seemed. To any outside observer, it was just a piece of land, a few rows of grapes, a place to cultivate and harvest. But for Naboth, that vineyard was a living testament. It was the tangible connection to his roots, to his family, to the promises God had made to the people of Israel when they entered the Promised Land. Because the law was clear. Leviticus 25 established that the land belonged to God and that Israelite families were only temporary stewards. The inheritance was not to be sold permanently. It was to be passed down from generation to generation, keeping the identity and memory of the people alive. Selling the inheritance was not just a commercial transaction, it was disobeying God. And Naboth took this seriously. He wasn't a fanatic. He wasn't inflexible out of stubbornness. He simply understood that faithfulness to God has a cost, and that this cost is worthwhile, even when it's inconvenient, even when the king is on the other side of the negotiation. But not everyone saw it that way. For some, laws were merely suggestions, principles were negotiable, and the will of God, well, that depended on who was in charge. Naboth was about to discover that when political expediency clashes with spiritual loyalty, conflict is not only inevitable, it is deadly. Because the vineyard that couldn't be sold was located exactly where someone very powerful wanted to build something new, and that someone wouldn't take no for an answer. Ahab was king. He had palaces. He had armies. He had accumulated wealth and recognized power, but there's something about power that never seems to be enough. He always wants more. And Ahab wanted that vineyard, not because I needed it, not because it was essential, but because it was there, next to his palace in Jezreel, and he imagined it would be perfect for a vegetable garden, a convenience, a whim, the desire of a man who never learned that not everything is for sale. So Ahab went to Naboth with a proposal. At first glance it seemed fair. He offered to buy the vineyard for a generous price or exchange it for a better property. In the eyes of the world, it was a reasonable deal. But Naboth replied firmly, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." It was a respectful no, of course, based on God's law. But for Ahab, it was unbearable. 1 Kings 21:4 describes the king's reaction in almost comical detail, if it weren't so tragic. Ahab went home sullen and angry. He lay down on his bed, turned his face away, and refused to eat. A grown king throwing a tantrum like a spoiled child. But this wasn't just a scene of immaturity. It was the prelude to a tragedy. And since we're talking about powerful, life-changing stories, if you're enjoying this content, please like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next exciting Bible stories that bring profound lessons for our times. But back to Ahab. He was lying there, refusing to eat, feeling wronged because someone dared to say no. And while he wallowed in self-pity, someone entered the room. Someone who didn't accept defeat. Someone who would turn frustration into conspiracy. Someone named Jezebel. While Ahab was weak, Jezebel was ruthless. She found her husband lying there, refusing food, sunk in melancholy, and her reaction was not consolation, it was contempt. "Is this how you rule Israel?" she asked with biting sarcasm. "Get up, eat, be merry, I'll get Naboth's vineyard for you." Jezebel was not just the queen. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon, raised in a culture where absolute power knew no moral limits. For her, Naboth's refusal was not a legitimate right, it was an intolerable affront. And affronts needed to be eliminated. But Jezebel was clever. She didn't use brute force. She didn't send soldiers to seize the vineyard by force. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she wove a plot in the shadows. She manipulated the system. She perverted justice. She turned the law into a weapon. Because evil rarely presents itself with horns and claws. It comes with official papers, with prepared witnesses, with an appearance of legality. And that is exactly what Jezebel did. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with the royal seal, and sent them to the leaders and nobles of Jezreel. The message was clear. Proclaim a fast, put Naboth in the spotlight, and find 2 false witnesses to accuse him of blasphemy against God and treason against the king. The trap was set, and Naboth had no idea that his honest no had triggered a deadly conspiracy. That injustice was masquerading as justice, that those in power had decided he didn't deserve to live, because when Jezebel decided on something, she wouldn't stop until she got it. And no one, not even a man faithful to God, was safe. What makes injustice truly terrifying is not overt violence. It's when it masquerades as justice. The leaders of Jezreel received Jezebel's letters, and cowardly, they obeyed. They proclaimed a public fast, as if it were a moment of spiritual seeking. They placed Naboth in a prominent position, as if he were someone important to be listened to. But it was all theater, a macabre charade. Then the witnesses came forward. 2 men, probably bribed or threatened, stood up publicly and said, "Naboth blasphemed against God and the king." These were lies, but they were lies told at the right time, in the right place, to the right people. And the crowd, the community that knew Naboth, they remained silent, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of convenience, perhaps because it's easier to let injustice happen than to risk everything for a condemned man. The law of Moses required 2 or 3 witnesses to condemn someone to death. The law was fulfilled, but only in form, not in spirit, because those witnesses were false. The accusations were fabricated, and the whole process was an elaborate fraud to give the appearance of justice to the murder. Imagine Naboth at that moment, standing before the crowd, hearing the accusations, knowing they were lies, realizing that no one would defend him. Understanding that the system that should have protected him was being used to destroy him. He had no lawyer, he had no defense, he had no escape, because when those in power decide to use the law as a weapon, the innocent have nowhere to run. And then came the sentence, the most brutal, the most public, the most shameful: stoning. Naboth was taken outside the city, the crowd gathered, the stones were erected. And an innocent man, guilty only of obeying God, was brutally murdered in the name of a justice that did not exist. 1 Kings 21:13 coldly records, "Then the 2 scoundrels came and sat down opposite him and brought the charges against Naboth before the people. Then they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. It wasn't quick, it wasn't painless, it was public, it was humiliating. It was the price Naboth paid for saying no to wrong and yes to God." Jezebel ordered Naboth killed, not because he was dangerous, not because he was a criminal, but because he was an obstacle, and obstacles need to be removed. That's the cold logic of abuse of power. When you have authority, you can transform inconvenience into crime and execution into justice. But what is most shocking is not just Naboth's death, it's that according to 2 Kings 9:26, his sons were also killed. The line of inheritance was completely eliminated. The family was wiped out. To ensure that no one else could claim that vineyard, Naboth died for his faithfulness. His sons died because someone wanted a vegetable garden. When obeying God comes at a price, sometimes that price is everything. And Naboth paid it, with blood, with dignity, with his life and the lives of those he loved. And then came the silence. Naboth was dead, his sons too. The vineyard changed hands. Ahab got out of bed, dressed, and went to take possession of the property. There was no mourning. There was no investigation. There was no justice, only the heavy silence of a consummated injustice. Power had won, greed had triumphed, and a faithful man lay buried under stones and lies. To any outside observer, this was a story about how the world really works. The powerful do what they want, the weak suffer what they must, and justice is just a pretty word we use to feel better. But there was something that Ahab and Jezebel didn't realize. Something that the cowardly leaders of Jezreel didn't consider, something that the false witnesses ignored. God was watching everything, not as a distant spectator, not as an indifferent judge, but as the God who sees, the God who cares, the God who does not leave injustice unanswered. And as Ahab walked through his newly acquired vineyard, savoring his victory, he didn't know that someone was coming to meet him. Someone sent directly by God, someone who had no fear of kings, the prophet Elijah. And the message that Elijah brought was not one of congratulations, it was one of judgment. "You killed and then took possession?" Elijah's words echoed through the vineyard like thunder. Ahab tried to deflect, tried to downplay, but Elijah wasn't there for conversation. He was there with a divine pronouncement. 1 Kings 21:19 records the devastating prophecy. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours. God had seen everything. Every lie, every false testimony, every stone thrown, and he did not remain silent. Naboth's faithfulness was not ignored. His integrity was not forgotten, and though he did not live to see it, divine justice came. Ahab would die in battle, and dogs would lick his blood just as Elijah prophesied. Jezebel would have an even more horrific end, thrown from a window, trampled by horses, and her body devoured by dogs until almost nothing remained. You might ask, but why did Naboth have to die? Why didn't God save him sooner? Why did justice come too late for him? And the answer is difficult. We don't always understand God's timing. We don't always see redemption in this life. But that doesn't mean God doesn't see it. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. It doesn't mean injustice will go unpunished forever. Naboth lost his life, but he kept his soul. He lost his vineyard, but he maintained his integrity. He was murdered by men, but he was vindicated by God. And her story has echoed through the centuries as a testament to the fact that faith in the midst of persecution is not weakness. It is the purest courage there is, because when everything can be taken from you, and yet you choose to obey God, that is true faith. So how much is your integrity worth? Naboth shows us that integrity is not cheap, it's not easy, and it certainly doesn't guarantee a happy ending in this life. He said no to the king. He remained faithful to God, and he paid with everything he had. But his story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What would you do in Naboth's place? If they said your refusal would cost you your life, would you stand your ground? If they threatened your family, would you give in? Because the world is still full of Ahabs and Jezebels. There are still systems that pervert justice. There are still times when saying no to wrong can be costly. And the question is not whether those times will come, but what we will do when they do. Naboth did not have a happy ending, but he had something greater, an eternal legacy. His story is in the Bible not as an example of senseless tragedy, but as a testament to the price of integrity and the value of faithfulness. Jesus would later say, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" Mark 8:36. Ahab gained a vineyard. Naboth lost his life. But in the end, it was Ahab who truly lost everything, because integrity is the only thing you can take with you when everything else is taken away. It's the only wealth that death cannot steal. It's the only investment that yields eternal returns. So today, when you are tempted to give in, when the pressure comes, when yes seems easier than no, remember Naboth, remember that God sees, and remember that there are things that are not. They have a price, not even when the whole world is offering them. The story of Naboth is tragic, but it is also profoundly necessary, because we live in a world that teaches us to be practical, flexible, and negotiable. A world that says integrity is beautiful until it costs something, that principles are important until they become inconvenient, that faith is admirable until it demands sacrifice. Naboth shows us the opposite. He shows us that there are sacred things, that there are lines that should not be crossed, that there are times when no is the only honest answer, even when it costs everything. And their story reminds us of something fundamental. God sees when no one else is looking. When injustice seems to triumph, when power seems invincible, God sees and he answers, perhaps not in our time, perhaps not in the way we expect, but he answers. So what are you going to do with this story? Are you just going to admire it like an old tale, or are you going to let it transform the way you live? Leave a comment below. What area of your life needs Naboth's courage today? If this video touched your heart, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel for more life-changing Bible stories. and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you forgotten stories from the Bible that carry powerful lessons for our times. Because in the end, the story of Naboth isn't just about a man who said no. It's about all of us, who at some point will have to choose between convenience and character, between popularity and principles, between what is easy and what is right. And when that moment arrives, may we have the courage of Naboth, the faith of one who trusts that God sees all, and the hope that even when justice seems delayed, it will come, because integrity has a price, but lacking integrity costs you your soul. Until the next video, and may God give us the courage to say no when necessary, and the peace to trust that He sees everything.